So one of the key questions that we ask ourselves, what are the implications of emission mitigation pathways, both compatible with 2 degrees and of lower ambition, and of no ambition at all as well, for the major economies?
And therefore, we looked into the results of regions like China, the EU, Japan, India, and what you can see is that especially the baseline scenarios, the scenarios without climate policy of these regions are very, very different, and they're driven by different outlooks for population or economic growth.
Particularly the emerging economies in our cost-effective scenarios are doing a lot of emissions reduction.
Emissions have to peak around 2020 or 2030, and that's really, really challenging, because so far in the policy discussions, most of these regions expect to be later.
And this is summarized maybe most succinctly in this chart that looks at the regional carbon budget. Carbon budget is a very well-known term. It refers to the sum of emissions over time. It is very well known because it's highly correlated and predicts very well temperature, which is what we care about, climate. But mostly it has always been looked at the global level.
The global carbon budget, the global amount of emissions that we can put into the atmosphere is limited at around 1,000 gigatons CO2.
Here we did a step forward and we looked at carbon budgets regionally, and what we found from this, you can easily see from this chart, is that if we do not commit to climate policies, or even if we do commitment to climate policies which are consistent with the current pledges, Copenhagen pledges, then the carbon budgets of big countries or regional aggregates such as Asian economies or OECD economies would be big enough to exceed the admissible budget allowed to stay below 2 degrees, which is this gray area that you see here. On the other hand, if you were to move to policies consistent with 2 degrees, which is our colored here in the light red, this budget would be reduced very considerably, and essentially no countries would get an allocation or a budget of emissions which would exceed a few hundred billion tons of CO2, which is relatively small.
And this is clearly important for the negotiations, because countries have very different perspectives on what they need to do based on what they know that others have done in the past.